Welcome, and we are so honored to have each and every one of you here with us today for this important and timely conversation. I want to thank Father Thomas Curran, Congressman Emanuel Joe Reardon, John Sherman, and Younis for joining us today. I also want to let our audience at home know that while we have just taken off our masks, we are 14 feet apart, and so are being very cognizant of safe social distancing measures. So I'll just jump right into it, because we have a lot to talk about today. And we're living in a very interesting time, to say the least. We're living in a time that is nearly unprecedented in terms of the stark polarization of our country. And this pandemic has really highlighted social inequities. The Black Lives Matter movement has recently forced us all to reckon with the long history of structural racism in this country that continues to oppress and ultimately take the lives of people of color. JCRB AGC's mission is to combat anti-Semitism and to pursue justice, but as we all know, pursuing justice is quite a large umbrella term. So I want to start with Congressman Cleaver to ask, what does justice mean to you in your role? What would success look like if we're able to achieve some sort of tangible amount of justice here in Kansas City? And how do you think that we can come together as a Kansas City community to find common ground, and in today's environment especially, in order to do that?
Let me take the antithetical way of responding by first saying what it's not. And when I think about justice, it cannot be just us. And it means that people would be treated with the highest level of equality. It also means that there's a level of freedom to be who we are. The most malignant form of ignorance is the ignorance of one's ignorance. The overwhelming majority of Americans, if you ask them a question about their view of others who are different, they say, I'm completely raceless. I have no problems with people who are of another faith tradition. I mean, because the heart is deceitful above all things. It comes out of a book that Father Curran and I probably read many, many times. And it is deceitful. And the number one person who it gets is us.
And Gavi, you talked about finding common ground. And for many of us generationally, we lived in a time where political discourse did attempt to find common ground. I'm wondering if it seeks to understand the other person at all. And so I'm very worried about our young people who have not been exposed to a civic or civil dialogue that seeks to understand the other and find a common ground. And instead, we're just fed this constant division time after time in the media. I'm concerned that young people are not really well versed in the idea of trying to understand others and coming to a common place. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to try to provide those opportunities for that to kind of dialogue and coming together to occur. And, you know, in the business world, there has been a progression to where we understand that we have to work in teams and that we have to work with diverse people to try to move things forward. I'm afraid that that isn't occurring in our political and civil dialogues, and I think it's hurting our ability to move forward in a common way.
If I may just kind of use that platform, I very much appreciate what Congressman Cleaver said, that it's not just us, but really this notion of inclusiveness. And I really think there's three parts to justice. And it's really, the foundation of justice is really a right relationship with the transcendent, however one identifies that in terms of God or Allah or higher power. It's a right relationship with one's sisters and brothers, but it's also a right relationship with the planet. The fracturing of any of those relationships is an injustice. And to Joe's point about, not just in the political arena, but also in the faith community, unfortunately, I believe folks are coming into the temple, to the mosque, to churches as partisans rather than as people of faith. And they're coming in as Democrats or Republicans, as opposed to coming in to the temple, to the synagogue, to the church as a person of faith, and then going into the public square influenced by that.
I think it's also important to recognize that justice is a political term, and we can legislate justice by securing individual rights and preserving objective law. But a right is not a right unless it's secured in principle and on paper. So when we talk about rights on paper, we're talking about politics and we're talking about policy. But we also need to be talking about rights in terms of principles. And this is where the culture has to come in. It's not enough that we become social activists that pursue equitable policy. We need to make sure that our culture is enshrined in the hearts of the individual members of a society, which requires the culture to also participate in the quest for justice, either through the arts or through faith communities. It has to be symbiotic.
I'm glad you brought up culture, because I think what Joe was talking about, our civil discourse, is something's broken, right? And despite all that's going on, and maybe it's fading a little bit, but this period of time has actually given me some hope, because I think that people are listening more than they did. I mean, maybe not in Washington, but as I think about communities and businesses and in the work I do, I think people are listening. I think they are trying to learn, and I think there is a lot of empathy. I think people are trying to put themselves in other people's shoes. That takes a conscious effort, and I think that's a cultural thing.
John, you bring up a great point. After George Floyd's murder, we at the Chamber tried to figure out what we could do to sort of enter into the conversation and be a benefit to our business members. And thanks to partnerships with you and I and the Prospect Business Association, we had a series of listening sessions online about the Black experience in Kansas City. And it culminated with our Power of Diversity event, which we did virtually. Congressman Cleaver was our guest speaker. We had 1,700 people at that event, probably 4 times more than we've ever had in person. So I do think this is a moment in time where people are really wanting to dive into this, both with their hearts and minds.
No, I think that's hopeful, but I also think we're talking about it and we're making statements about it, but how do we convert that into action?
I agree, John, and I like that distinction that's being made with people being called a racist. Well, it's one thing, no, I'm not a racist, but are you anti-racist? Right? So you maybe just be passive in terms of not doing anything that's racist, but are you doing anything to correct the racism, right? And so that distinction is necessary. So I think there's too many of us that get offended when we're called a racist. Well, I'm not a racist. Okay, well, maybe, but you are very passive. And how are we accepting those challenges to be anti-racist?
I do think that this moment in time is sort of tearing away the veil of apathy in our society. Well, I'd like to hope at least that that's the case. You know, there's certainly still populations and communities who feel like it's not necessarily their fight. Joe, I'd love to sort of piggyback off of what you were already bringing up and really talk about economic equity. Why does equity matter?
There's a moral imperative here that sits at the core of what we're talking about. And we don't want to let loose of that at all. But you can certainly make a business and economic case for inclusive prosperity and lifting people up. And there's no doubt about it. Prior to COVID, there's several studies that prove that those communities that were more inclusive in their prosperity were communities that were growing faster and more robustly. I think that this sort of lifting the veil, as you've described it, is incumbent upon us to say that we no longer can stand by and just accept that there are thousands of our fellow Kansas Cityans that are absent from the economy that we benefit from every day. And I firmly believe that those cities and regions that figure out how to take that opportunity and bring people into the economy and engage them, particularly in Black and minority communities that have been excluded intentionally over time, those are going to be the cities that win. If you look at the cities that are attractive to young people, it's the cities that embrace their diversity, that lift up and address those issues of a historic nature around racism and inequality. That's the kind of Kansas City that we want. We want to be able to broadcast that far and wide.
Yeah. I think what you're describing is the danger of sort of complacency with the status quo in terms of understanding that our institutions and our structures are built to uphold a system that very much favors certain communities over others. And so I hear also what Father Curran was saying, which is that it's not enough to simply not be racist, but that what are we all doing in order to be proactively anti-racist, both in our interactions with individuals on a cultural level, but also on an institutional level. John, as a civic and philanthropic leader in Kansas City, you've really sought to create sustainable regional impact through your business, philanthropic, and major league sports efforts in Kansas City. How does equity and justice play into that equation for you?
You know, when I think about a night like this, I think a lot about Henry Block. I spent a lot of time with Henry. He was certainly someone I looked up to. I mean, he fought in World War II. He came back. He built his business, helped create the greatest entrepreneurial economy in history. But if you ask him when he came back, he was just trying to make a living for his family. He's a great example among others that we have in Kansas City, that it ultimately became bigger than him. And he saw that he had a responsibility to give back to the community, and he did it massively. And, in fact, Henry, he was always a guy that I wanted to learn from, but he wanted to learn from you. When he was 80 years old or incredibly well established, it was hard to get him to talk about himself because he wanted to learn from you because you were in the game. I've certainly had a great opportunity to build a couple of businesses here in Kansas City. Could not have imagined when I started those businesses what they could become, and certainly could never have imagined owning the Major League Baseball team here in Kansas City. But I think when you have enough, you should think about others. And I think this community does that in spades. We fight above our weight class all the time when you compare us to similarly sized cities across the country. I think about a Major League sports franchise. I ran a public company for 12 years, and this is a private company, but it's way more public than the public. They should have told me that, sports is the only industry that has its own section in the newspaper. And we try to do a lot of things for good in the community. And a lot of this was inspired by people like Henry Block and Ewing Kauffman. There are so many in Kansas City. But we have chosen in our philanthropy to focus on education, really create more opportunities for the underserved, based upon just the basic premise that where you end up shouldn't be dictated by where you start. But there's no question that people have different starting points in our community and all societies. And sometimes it's a frustrating area to be in strategically because it's hard for you to see that you're moving the needle on a macro level. But no question you are moving sometimes it doesn't take much, right? It's about believing in someone more than they believe in themselves, turning on a light in a dark room. And it just doesn't take very much. So the satisfaction that I take from that is that you can impact a child at a time, a family at a time, and ultimately that creates generational change.
I think we're all agreeing in a subtle way that most people, whether they're in business or in faith communities or different sectors of society, are well-intentioned. They mean well. But diversity, inclusion, providing opportunity, it's not something that's going to happen organically. It's going to require a conscious effort. And do your part.
If we think we're going to get better just staying where we are, it's not going to happen. We've got to meet people from all backgrounds and traditions and understand them, understand who they are and why they are who they are. And there's one danger. I'm on the Homeland Security Committee 3 weeks ago in our hearing. I asked Director Rye of the FBI, what is the biggest threat to our country? And he said on September the 4th, 2020, that the greatest danger to the United States of America right now are white militias and white supremacy. You can check it up. That's a problem. We don't want to accept that, but that is the greatest problem, not China and not Russia.
So that is a perfect segue, Congressman Cleaver, to pivoting to my last question. Speaking of white supremacy and white nationalism, as we know, over the last few years, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in white nationalist and white supremacist activity, something that obviously directly affects the Jewish community. These groups, though, have become pretty savvy, politically savvy, and they're able to enter mainstream discourse. Often they know better than to label themselves as white supremacists or white nationalists, so they use labels like Western, chauvinist, anti-immigrant or immigrant restrictionist, American identity, those types of terms, although we can certainly see through that. As a country that cares deeply about free speech, we know that there are limits to what the government can do to stop or deter these groups. However, that limit doesn't apply to civil society, and what we can do as faith leaders, as business owners, as civic leaders to ensure that these viewpoints are stigmatized and made wholly unwelcome. These groups have a strong presence in our region in particular. We've got white nationalist groups in the past and on campuses even as close as Johnson County Community College. The American Identity Movement is using K-State to start their pilot program of creating a campus movement. I'd love to hear what we think we can do to deter this hate from being normalized and make it wholly unwelcome in our civil society.
I think from As someone in education and in the faith business, if you will, I think it starts with the instruction. I like to say that on our campus, our students should feel safe, but they should not feel comfortable. There's a difference. In fact, we are to be about creating discomfort in the existing narrative, that we have just perpetuated. In campuses right now, there's this whole concern about the narrative because it's surfaced as a result of the New York Times 1619 Project. And the 1619 Project challenges the notion that historians for centuries have said that the three significant dates in our history are 1776, the Civil War, and World War II. And now this project is saying, no, we need to look at the arrival of the first slaves in 1619, and the narrative should be looked at differently. That's created upheaval in higher ed because that should be the role of historians, not journalists. And how dare a group such as the New York Times produce such a project? What has happened is that it is creating discomfort, a lot of conversation around that, for a further exploration of that. And that is being welcomed by our students because they say, well, okay, I'm familiar with the existing narrative, but tell me about this other narrative so that I have a fuller understanding. That to me is a sign of hope because as we spoke earlier about the next generation, well, Generation Z, what Generation Z is looking for is not just a good job, they're looking for quality of life. While there may not be many, but there's certainly some, and very, very forceful white supremacists, there clearly has been a narrative in our nation of the supremacy of whites. And the narrative needs to be examined so that we're more fully informed. John Lewis has said, what does it mean to have the beloved community when I truly see someone as my sister and my brother, and race aside, that we are one community? So I'll get off my soapbox there. But
no, I think, thank you so much. I think that's great. And I think it's a good sort of segue to Younis in terms of really thinking about the role, I think, of the media, of writing, of journalism in recrafting this narrative or making us uncomfortable in the ways we need to be made uncomfortable.
Sure, because media is playing a very much bigger role in this than we might imagine. And I say that in reference to social media in particular. You cannot talk about the media these days unless you address the social media, because 49% of our media is consumed via Facebook, and that's not really taking into account YouTube and all the other social platforms that are out there. And we know now, they have confessed admittedly that the algorithms and the interfacing and all the other jargon, technical jargon, which I'm not quite familiar with, is designed to condition people to be addictive and to also reinforce their confirmation bias, to create silos. It's been an extremely destructive force in mobilizing hate groups, organizing hate groups, because disorganized hate, if you're just hating people in a very disorganized, random way, you're just crazy. But get a logo, get a Facebook page, get some swag, and all of a sudden you have a cause. And we live at a time when people are looking for a cause, and they're looking for causes that give them a sense of meaning and identity. And there's a larger picture that ties into the reasons for that, including some of the disintegration of some of our social institutions like families and schools and education and all that. But that's a much larger, broader issue. But we have to address the social media issue because of how destructive they are. And make no mistake about it, they're incredibly destructive, especially for people under the age of 25. People under the age of 25 have a 5 times higher rate now of anxiety and depression, which I think you can attribute a great part of that to social media. And there's a lot out there in terms of, Netflix just recently did The Social Dilemma documentary kind of explaining why this phenomenon is happening, but we need to address it. And that is going to require a social movement because social media is ironically antisocial. It is destroying our social lives. It is destroying our personal lives. And it's not the best source of information. And so we need to have a movement to reverse this. And the way to do that is to turn the poison into a social medicine. And it can be done. And it can be done the same way that you exert pressure on politicians to change policy. You can exert pressure on corporations. And it's happening. We see that Zuckerberg is listening. I mean, he would not be listening if people were not up in arms and pointing these things out. So one of the ways that we dismantle hate groups is we have to deconstruct them. We have to deconstruct them the way you would deconstruct a cult and say, these are the cheap little special effects that are being employed to manipulate your mind. And that's one way to do it.
Absolutely. Employing social media companies as partners in this, as well as, I think, strengthening media literacy, right, are things that we can do.
That's as big a challenge as you could throw out. I met with Mr. Zuckerberg for about an hour. We called, made an appointment. We talked and argued. And he's doing some things now that he said he wouldn't do back last November when I met with him. But he's changed. I guess he's watching and seeing what's going on. But words may be the most powerful thing on this planet. And words precede everything. After Charlottesville, I was quoted in the Kansas City Star as saying, there's no such thing as a good Nazi. You can go back and check this. A woman wrote a letter to the editor. She was not ashamed and said, Cleaver is dead wrong. This is in the Kansas City Star, local newspaper, and beat up on me for saying that there's no such thing as a good Nazi. And I thought, we're in trouble. Even if she believed that, there was a time when nobody would have wanted to say that in polite society. That was reserved for the dark rooms. I believe in open society, I believe freedom of speech and all that. There's got to be some kind of way that we can control it a little bit better than we are doing now.
I think you're right that we all need to take a very active stand. And it's back to this same conversation of being an anti-racist, being proactive in our beliefs and not just saying, well, of course I don't believe in white supremacist ideals, but what are we doing to actively combat that and make sure that these people don't feel that their ideologies are welcome in our public discourse? And I hope certainly that one day very soon, saying something like there's no such thing as a good Nazi will not be a controversial statement or not be something that someone would feel empowered to publicly argue with you about. And I think that that's kind of what we need to absolutely get back to. And it's certainly from the Jewish community's perspective, the kind of allyship that we need as we see this rise in extremism from far-right white nationalist and white supremacist groups. We need all of our friends and our allies to be very vocal and very public and very strong in unequivocally condemning that.
I do want to say that I think we need to reinstate the gatekeepers. One of the things that we have lost are the gatekeeping roles. And that's not to say that you need gatekeepers in order to censor people or to censor or alter content, but it is to say that when you have gatekeeping mechanisms in place, you have ethical standards in place. And, there used to be a time when I would tell people, stay away from mainstream media, look for alternative sources of media. Now I'm completely the opposite. I'm like, stay with the mainstream media. Don't go to alternative sources of media because it's the wild, wild west.
I just echo what Congressman Cleaver said. Language matters, what we say matters, statements matter.
Yes.
We need to boldly push back on those things that are unacceptable, break out of our sort of Kansas City friendly and not just be quiet, but to be bold and push back, and then support JCRB and AJC, which you are doing such a great job of mixing it up out there in social media, bringing the facts and the evidence to the table. We also, as adults that have influence over young people, we have to do what we can to have real conversations with young people around real issues and teach the art of listening better. It is terribly demoralizing to get onto social media and see all the comments that are underneath something. It's not a discussion. It's literally in writing, yelling at one another and not being willing to understand a bit about what the other person's saying. I think it just leads to further polarization. But in those cases where there's white supremacists in our backyard, we have to push back. And even our organizations need to be willing to do a better job of that. But we've got to define those lanes where things are not acceptable to us. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you, Joe, so much. And really thank you to all of our wonderful guests. I think just to close, I would say, to reiterate some of the comments that I heard, is that if we're not taking those types of risks, if we're not slightly uncomfortable, if we are not using our political capital to do the right thing and to pursue justice and equity and change culture in the way that it needs to be changed, I would posit that we're not getting a lot done. So it absolutely comes with some risk and some discomfort, and I hope that we can count on, I know that we can count on everyone in this room. I hope that we can also count on all of our guests to this event as allies to all of us as we seek to pursue a better Kansas City and society. Thank you.